I had mixed emotions when I went back home a couple of weeks ago to Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. I had gone to Chicago, Illinois for the funeral of my uncle, and I decided that weekend, that Sunday, I was going to go to Champaign. I actually went to Joliet first and worshiped with Matt and Lauren Bassford, and then drove to Champaign that afternoon. It was a good experience. I have a lot of great memories going back home. I went to my high school, Urbana High School, and man, they have redone so much there. There's a swimming pool there that wasn't there when I was there. They have this Hall of Fame for athletes, and I was looking for my name on that Hall of Fame list, and I was not on there, okay? And I quit the basketball team sophomore year. I went and did homework instead of sitting on the bench. But anyway, so I did not make that list. I went to the University of Illinois and visited the campus a little bit, and that was fun. Obviously, when you go back home, you got to get something to eat, right? So I went to a restaurant called Zorba's, and they have these gyros, and they're really good. I went there with my uncle, and it was a good opportunity to go back home and spend time with my uncle and my mom for a little bit, and I spent some time with a good friend of mine, Dustin, on Monday morning before I drove back to Chicago and flew back home. But I also had some mixed emotions going home. Well, I had a lot of great memories going back home and a lot of great things that I was able to experience growing up. I had some bad memories too. You see, when I went back home, I had a conversation, if you want to describe it like that, with my father. Now, my father has passed away. He's been dead for a few years now, but I went to visit where he's buried. And, you know, during that time, you kind of think about a lot of different things. And I had a lot of different emotions running through my mind, some good and some not so good. My dad was a good man at times. He did a lot of good things. He took care of his family when he could. He had a great laugh, had a big smile. He was a hard worker. And at the same time, there were some things, some mixed emotions that I had. Because, I'll just be honest with you, I had a difficult childhood throughout those years in Champaign-Urbana. Dad made a lot of mistakes in his life, and yet he's still Dad, right? Even though Dad made a lot of mistakes, he's still my father. And I think sometimes one of the hardest things to do for young people is how do you go about processing and responding and handling a situation, particularly when it's your mom and dad, or your mom or father, when they make some kind of mistake in their lives. It can be difficult for young people to kind of process what's going on with situations like that. And sad to say that there are going to be a lot of young people who are going to see their mother and their father make some poor choices throughout their lives, and sometimes those choices can have some severe consequences on that young person. I want to talk for a few minutes to our young people, and I know some of our young people are scattered abroad. That's okay, scattered around. I want to talk a little bit about when parents make mistakes. We have done a lot of sermons here for our young people. We talk a lot about choices, and we talk a lot about right and wrong and doing the right thing, things like that. But I think it's important for our young people to know some things about their parents. In particular, what happens when your parents make mistakes? I saw my dad make a lot of mistakes, and you may have seen your parents already make some mistakes in their lives. And if you haven't, then at some point in time you will. And I want us to think about a man in the Bible. Open up your Bible to 2 Samuel chapter 11. We may not think about this man as much as we should, at least pertaining to his childhood. I'm talking about the man named Solomon. And what I mean by that, we may not think as much about this man with respect to his childhood. I think at times Solomon may have had a very challenging childhood. Now, we know a lot of the stories and a lot of the events surrounding Solomon, right? He wrote many of the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, and he's the wisest man to live. And yet there's a lot of things that maybe we overlook with respect to his childhood, which I think is very important for young people. And obviously there's some lessons to learn as parents who are in the audience tonight too. Solomon's life, when you think about it, his father was David, King David. So you would think that Solomon would have had a fairly easy life, right? He's growing up with the king. He's the king's son. And yet I think there's a lot of challenges that Solomon would have experienced in his life. Because his father David made some mistakes, right? We're going to pick up the story here in a little bit. We know the situation in 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse number 24. We're introduced to the birth of Solomon. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 12 and look at verse number 24. It says, "Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba and went into her and lay with her, and she gave birth to a son, and he named him Solomon. Now the Lord loved him." So we're introduced to Solomon in this story here, or in this text. And what I want us to do, particularly for the young people, I want you to take home a couple of thoughts this afternoon with respect to what happens when your parents, when your mom, or maybe your father, what happens? What do you do? How do you respond? What do you need to remember when mom or dad makes some mistakes in their lives? There are some things as I grew up I had to process and I had to figure out. And there may be some things in your life, maybe even right now, that you're going to have to kind of work through and navigate. And if not right now, maybe at some point in your life, you're going to have to consider some things. So let me share with you 3 thoughts that I want you to hold on to. The first thought is this, and it's pretty straightforward, but it needs to be discussed. Parents are going to make mistakes. I know that can be a shocker, all right? But parents are going to make mistakes. You know, sometimes young people, depending on their age, may look at mom and dad and say, man, they're perfect. They're my hero. They do everything right. But eventually, young people are going to come to understand that at times, parents are going to make mistakes. I couldn't help but think about Solomon. Don't you think that Solomon would have idolized his father? I mean, if your dad was King David, think about it for a second. How amazing would that have been to grow up in the house of David? Not just to grow up, but you are his son. Imagine the bedtime stories that King David would have told Solomon. I was thinking about this, and I was wondering, did David ever say to Solomon, son, let me tell you about this story. Let me tell you about a young boy who defeated this mighty giant with one pebble, with one rock. And Solomon listening to this story and saying, wow, that is amazing. Who was that young boy, Dad? Did you know who he was? Well, he was actually me, son. I was the one who did that, okay? Or what about if David, you know, as he's talking to his son Solomon, he's describing to him, son, let me tell you about some of the mighty battles that me and my boy Jonathan had throughout the years. We didn't lose at all. How amazing would that have been? And think about being Solomon growing up with David as your father. Son, today I'm going to teach you how to write some music. You're going to learn how to play some instruments. In a couple of months, I'm going to show you how to use a sword, how to fight. Or what about the conversation that they could have had over dinner or something like that, where David pulled out his copy of the law? The kings were to make their own copy of the law. So I'm going to give this to you one day, but I want you to start reading this, and I want you to start studying this, and I want you to start making application in your life. Wouldn't it have been amazing to be the son of King David? And all of the things that David could have shared with Solomon. Let me tell you about leadership, son. How everything rises and falls with leadership. Solomon was privileged to have all of this information at his disposal. And yet, I can't help but think about, how did Solomon learn about his father's past? Who was his mom? Bathsheba. When did that conversation take place? At some point in time, Solomon's going to learn some things about mom and dad, right? Did he hear something in the court or something like that? Hey, I heard something about your dad. Did your dad do that? I don't know. I've never heard that. Did David tell him what happened? Did Bathsheba? Did they talk about having a crucial conversation? Son, I need to talk to you about a couple of things, okay? Because you're going to learn some things. Can you imagine what may have been running through Solomon's mind? Look back in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And we need to make sure that we understand this. Sometimes we can read through this quickly. Make sure that you understand that Solomon, he would have been hit with a lot of stuff when you look back at what happened with the story between David and Bathsheba. In 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verse number 2, now when evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. We know that was talking about Bathsheba. We know what would happen later on. Drop down to verse number 26 and verse number 27. Now when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead. Now, we skipped over a lot, but David, throughout that chapter, he was plotting and planning and scheming and being deceitful to the point that he had Uriah murdered or set him up to die so that he could be with Bathsheba. Now, when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. When the time of mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife. Then she bore him a son. But the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. Don't you think that would have been devastating for Solomon to hear all of that? Or to at least come to terms and understand, wow, my dad, not my dad. My dad could have never done anything like that, right? Dad, say it's not so. Say you didn't do that, Dad. Well, son, it's true. I made some mistakes. I messed up. What might have been going through Solomon's mind? Anger, disappointment, confused, devastated. His friend, his protector, his hero, was now just like everybody else. Young people need to understand that your parents, from time to time, are going to make mistakes. They are not perfect. And the mistakes of David's life had an impact on Solomon. Maybe we don't think about this as much either. Turn over to chapter 12, and I want you to notice in verse number 10, remember that there was punishment. Now, David did not lose his life. But make no mistake about it, those mistakes came with a lot of consequences. In chapter 12 and verse number 10, Nathan talking to David, he said, now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house. Think about that. The sword is not going to depart from your house. You're going to have problems the rest of your life, David. You're going to have some challenges that could have been prevented, but based upon your choices, you're going to have a lot of challenges in your house because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. You see, the mistakes of David would have a ripple effect. And parents, there's something good for us to hold on to. We do these kids' night lessons, and I wonder sometimes if older people kind of just turn off the ignition or turn off the brain or whatever and just kind of just sit there. Listen, you need to pay attention to this too, because our choices, my choices, and your choices will have a ripple effect with respect to our children. Do we understand the seriousness of this? And young people, you need to understand, unfortunately, your parents are going to make some mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes will drastically impact your life. Now, let me just say this too. Not every mistake that a parent is going to make is going to be just life-changing, earth-shattering, okay? But sometimes it can be. And so young people, you need to know that parents sometimes, your parents, sometimes will make mistakes. Now, this is important, and let me tell you why this is so important. This is important because, secondly, understanding that they're going to make mistakes, you're going to have to make sure that you respond the right way. You're going to have to make sure that when you see mom and dad do something that they should not be doing, saying something or acting in a certain way, or whatever the case may be, you need to make sure that you respond a certain way. You really have two choices. You're going to have to decide, am I going to remain with the Lord? Am I going to stay with God? Or am I going to allow what mom and dad have done that caused me just to kind of drift away and rebel and not to listen to God? How did Solomon respond? We don't have all the details about all these early years and about all the interaction, but we do know some things about Solomon. Look over in 1 Kings chapter 3, and I want you to look at verse number 3. 1 Kings chapter 3, and I think this would be a good summary for most of Solomon's life here. In 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse number 3, look at what the Bible says here. Now Solomon loved the Lord, and that's very important. Despite all the things that happened with mom and with dad, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. I want you to hold on to right now the fact that he loved God, despite some of the mistakes that he saw with his father David. And look, adultery wasn't the only mistake that David made. There's a lot of other things that we could say too, like the numbering of the people. But despite all of these things, Solomon walked with God. The Bible says Solomon loved the Lord. Solomon made a choice despite what happened to dad. And for the young people here today, you're going to have to make the same choice, hopefully. You're going to have to make some choice. Whether or not you're going to follow in the footsteps of God, no matter what happens, no matter what mom or dad may do. or whether or not you're going to leave the Lord. I think there's something else that needs to be said. Go back to chapter 2 of 1 Kings. Despite the mistakes that David made, and I think this is important for young people, despite the mistakes that David made, Solomon still loved his dad. And Solomon still had a relationship with his father. Towards the end of David's life, it says, as David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son, saying, I am going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. So he's having like this last conversation. And I was thinking about that too with Joshua, and as the fathers here, think about what you would want to say to your children if you had maybe one last time to talk to them. David is going to encourage Solomon, and Solomon is going to listen to David. He's going to listen to the wisdom that he gave him. He said in verse 3, keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies according to what is written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn. David wanted his son to excel. He wanted his son to exceed the things that he had done. And he wanted him to continue to walk with God. And for the most part, Solomon listened to that. And there's something to be said about that too, because it can be very easy for young people when you see mom or dad make some type of mistake to say, you see, all of this stuff about Christianity and following God and following Jesus doesn't really work. Look at what mom and dad did. They made this big old mistake. I don't need to follow the Lord. We're going a little too far. Solomon saw some blunders from his father. That didn't mean he just said, I'm just going to dismiss God. What we find here in chapter 2 and in chapter 3, Solomon had to make a decision. And young people, you're going to have to make a decision. What are you going to do? How are you going to respond if or when mom or dad make some mistakes in their lives? I would tell you, growing up with my father, I had a lot of anger issues, okay? I mean, I had a lot of anger issues. I'd get angry, and it would get really bad because I'd cry, and that would make me even more angry because now I'm crying in front of people, and you don't want to cry like as a young boy in front of kids, so now I'm like even more angry, and I would threaten people and things like that. But I had a lot of anger issues toward Dad because essentially Dad abandoned us. He wasn't around. I've done sermons here. You guys have heard a lot of these stories, right? Dads, are we in the picture? Dad just wasn't really around. And I look at my photo albums and I don't see Dad. Where is he? No band. He wasn't there when I had some concerts or recitals, sports. He didn't really miss anything though with the sports because I wasn't even playing. But even if he was in the seat, that would have been good. He wasn't really around. You know, I took some photos with Nikki and Joshua after services. I don't really have any photos of Dad after worship services. Dad basically abandoned us. He wasn't there. And so I had a lot of anger, but I had to make some decisions. I had to decide and process, how am I going to respond? Dad was an alcoholic. Does that mean that I should be an alcoholic too? Well, my dad's an alcoholic, so he did that, and I'm really upset with Dad, and this is what Dad did to me, so I'm just going to do the same thing. What do you think about that? Is that wise? I had to make some decisions, and I had to process this. Young people, you're going to have to respond the right way when you see mom or dad maybe make some bad decisions in their lives. I could either blame Dad the rest of my life and live a life of bitterness, or I could forgive. I could try to mend the relationship, or I could just kind of ignore him the rest of my life. Young people are going to have to think about a lot of things. You're going to have to actively choose to do what's right. You're going to have to actively choose to forgive, and you're going to have to actively choose to do the right thing. Now, the danger is for young people when something big happens with mom or dad, and sometimes some big things can happen. If your mom or dad abandons you, it's a pretty big deal. I was reading a book by Stuart Scott, the guy on ESPN, Sports Center. You guys all know Stuart Scott, right? Booyah. He died a couple of years ago. Why are you laughing at that, David? That's funny. It's not that funny. All right, whatever. Anyway, he died a couple of years ago, and I was reading this book that he wrote, and he talked about how he got a divorce. And he said he never knew how that would affect his daughters. It changed their mindset. He had no idea that was going to happen. And I thought that was interesting. I was thinking about this lesson here because parents, there's something for us here. We can get a divorce, but we don't really see the long-term consequences until maybe years later. Young people, your parents may get divorced. In fact, there's probably a good chance that they will, sadly, even among God's people. Your parents may abandon you. What if they walk away from the Lord? What if they just say, look, I'm not going to follow God anymore? You have to decide how you're going to respond. Solomon decided that he was going to do the right thing. He was going to walk with God. Now, you can rebel, you can be angry, you can be hurt, and those emotions are normal, but we're going to have to rely upon the Lord, and you're going to have to make a decision before anything happens, that no matter what happens, I am going to do the right thing, and I'm going to remain with God. And let me tell you why that's so important. Here's my last thought I want to give you for tonight. You need to make sure that you respond the right way, because you are going to be held accountable to God for your actions. It doesn't matter what mom or dad has done. When you stand before God on the judgment day, you are going to be held accountable by God. Solomon made a lot of wise choices in his life, but just like his father, he made some poor choices too. The wisest man to live, had everything that a man could want, and yet, towards the end, he began to stumble. I want you to look at 1 Kings chapter 11 with me. 1 Kings chapter 11 and verses 1 through 4. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women. There's the problem right there. Verse 2. From the nations, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away from their God, away after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. There's a problem right there. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. Now look at verse 4 very closely. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. And drop down to verse 11. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. You see what God said? Solomon, you have done wrong. You have done wrong. The responsibility fell upon Solomon and not his father, David. Now, David had done a lot of bad things, but God, as he talked to Solomon, he said, Solomon, you are the one that is going to bear this responsibility. When you go up to verse 9, it says, now the Lord was angry with who? With Solomon, because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. God was upset with Solomon, and God said, I'm going to hold you accountable, Solomon. And every young person in here needs to understand, mom and dad are going to make some mistakes along the way. We try to be perfect. We try to respond. We try to do the right thing. We're flawed. We're going to make some mistakes, sometimes some bigger than others. But you need to understand that the way that you respond and the way you live the rest of your days, God is going to hold you accountable. When you stand before him on the judgment day, when I stand before him on the judgment day, I'm not going to be able to say, but my dad did this. This is my dad's fault. That's why I was doing this. God told Solomon, I'm looking at you. And this is on you, Solomon. And the same is going to be true for us. And so however you decide to respond, when you see mom or dad engaged in bad behavior, just make sure that you remember it will not be an excuse on the judgment day to say, well, this is what mom and dad did. You're going to have to be held accountable for your own decisions. Parents are going to make mistakes, but we can decide to do the right thing no matter what. And for all the young people here, I want you to hold on to the fact that you have a Father in heaven. That even when mom or dad may make some tremendous blunder, maybe the house just becomes a mess. And I'm not talking about things thrown around the house like laundry and stuff like that. Like a sword being in the house like King David. No matter what your mom or dad may do, always remember that you have a Father in heaven that loves you. You have a Father in heaven who cares about you. You have a Father in heaven who's never going to leave you. You have a Father in heaven you can always rely upon. A Father in heaven who sees everything you're going through. And you have Jesus Christ as an advocate, as a high priest, who can understand exactly how you are feeling. Make sure that you rely upon them no matter what happens with mom or with dad. You strive to walk with him in the good days and in the bad days. And when you do, you will be blessed. Remain with your Father in heaven, no matter what happens on this side of life. Let's stand and sing the song of invitation.